Good evening and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. This evening, we turn our attention to the growing military cooperation between the Russian Federation and Iran, a partnership that has sparked global concern due to its potential to destabilize an already volatile region. This alliance, forged out of shared geopolitical interest, raises alarming questions about the balance of power in Middle East and beyond. To help us understand this conflict, we are joined by a renowned geopolitical expert from Washington, D.C., Professor Mark Katz, who is Professor Emeritus of Government and Politics at George Mason University. Professor Katz has been following these developments closely and will offer his insights into the motivations behind this cooperation and its implications for global security. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So, sir, I would like to begin the discussion by asking that, considering the historical relationship between Russia and Iran, what are the key factors that have led to their recent deepening military cooperation, and how does this reflect on their broader geopolitical strategies?
Well, I think at present, the main thing that drives them together is common opposition to the United States, in particular, and to the West as a whole. But in that they both see the United States as a common adversary. This has obviously encouraged them to cooperate with each other.
Given the current dynamics in the Middle East, how do you see the Russian-Iran partnership influencing the power balance in the region, particularly with regard to Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Right. Well, I think that the important thing to note about Russian foreign policy, and this isn't just a characteristic of Putin, but of the Soviets and the Tsars as well, is that they like to support opposing sides simultaneous. That they don't just side with one against another, and so basically, what they want is, they're getting a lot of assistance from Iran. This is unprecedented. That usually it's been Russia that provides military assistance. Now they're receiving military assistance in this current war. But Russia has strong reasons to keep good relations with Saudi Arabia in particular, because of Saudi role in affecting the oil market. They need Saudi Arabia, especially now that their oil sales are under sanctions, to cooperate with them in keeping the price of oil higher than it could be if the Saudis had, responded positively to President Joe Biden's request that they increase production. The Saudis didn't do that, that they've kept their agreement with Russia through the OPEC Plus format. And that being the case, the Russians have no interest in the Iranians doing things that threaten the Saudis, at least, or threaten them too much. And even with Israel, what's fascinating is that under Putin in particular, Russian-Israeli relations have been relatively good. Now, they haven't been so good since October 7th, and Russia's been critical of U.S. policy, and not very sympathetic toward the Israelis. Yet, they do have still some important degree of cooperation. There's this famous deconfliction agreement that they have with regard to Syria, whereby the Israelis let the Russians know, when and where they're going to be targeting Iranian and Hezbollah positions in Syria. And I think for the Iranians, this is really something harmful. It means that the Russians could do something to protect them and Hezbollah assets, but they don't. And so even if Russian-Israeli relations are strained, that they are maintained. So in other words, for Russia, it's this great elaborate balancing act, if you will, that they don't want to be completely associated with Iran against its adversaries, but they're very happy to take Iranian support, that's for sure.
So, what are the potential risks of growing alliance between Russia and Iran for the stability in the Middle East?
Well, I think that Iran likes to act through its allies, whether it's Hezbollah or the Houthis or the Shia militias. They don't like to really get involved in conflicts themselves if they have a lot of enthusiastic volunteers elsewhere. And I think that what we've seen is that the Iranians, with this latest the death of the leader of Hamas in Tehran, which it's widely believed the Israelis are responsible for, and the Iranians have said they're going to retaliate, but they haven't, not yet. And it's not clear that they really want to, that they don't want to really get into a direct conflict with the Israelis themselves. They think that they would prefer for Hezbollah and the Houthis to do this, but not too much. In other words, not enough to bring the U.S. in a strong manner. So I think the Iranians sort of like the Russians, that they prefer to uh, sort of operate through others, if you will. And so I think that we could see a broader Middle East war. But what I think is amazing is that we haven't so far. I think that when Hamas made its October 7th attack, they were really under the impression that Hezbollah, the Iranians, were going to join with them. It didn't happen. Uh, and I think from, obviously the Israelis, whomever, are unhappy about the degree to which, Russia has been sympathetic to Hamas, but they haven't been providing arms to Hamas. They have been doing nothing material to help Hamas. And I think that they're not going to. Now, if Hezbollah gets involved, and there's obviously been a lot of exchanges across the Lebanese border. This, I think, could be much more problematic, both for Iran and for Russia, because Hezbollah has forces in Syria, helping to prop up the Assad regime. If there's really going to be an all-out Israeli-Hezbollah war, they're going to have to probably bring some of those people back. And does that mean that Russia's job gets a little harder, Iran's job? In other words, that the Assad regime isn't doing too badly, but if one of their main supporters kind of drops out, well, then I think this is just going to embolden the opposition to Assad, which is still there. So I don't think the Russians want to see this. So I think that they would prefer not to see a larger fight. And I don't think the Iranians really want to see this at this moment. In other words, if I mean, why hasn't it happened? In other words, if the Iranians were really willing to stomach this, I think that they would have encouraged Hezbollah, but I don't think they want to do this.
Yeah. So, we talked about the war. So now coming to the sanctions. So how do we assess the role of economic sanctions imposed by the West on Russia and Iran? Are these
Right.
sanctions pushing them closer, or like how can these sanctions be effective in order to counter their proposed so-called hegemony in the region?
Well, thing about both Republicans and Democrats in the United States, they all love sanctions. This is something that the United States just loves to impose. And, we impose a lot of sanctions on a lot of countries. Now, to tell you the truth, it doesn't ever seem to change anyone's behavior. They don't say, oh, we want to avoid this, so we will change it, we will be nice. No, maybe it makes them more costly for them to do things, but governments like Russia and Iran seem to be quite willing to bear the costs. And I think that the fact that we've imposed sanctions on so many countries, this does give them reason to cooperate with each other. That they're, now we've seen that, Russia and Iran do a lot of trade. Both are trading with China. There seems to be, a greater prospect of a Chinese-centered international monetary order that bypasses the use of the dollar. So I think if the US had been really serious, we would just focus on one or two countries to sanction. But no, and I think for American politicians, in other words, it's imposing sanctions is a way of being seen to do something which, at least for the United States, is not very costly. In other words, that impose sanctions on Russia and Iran. Well, that means, you're not using force or risking any kind of conflict. So it's a convenient policy, but, it's not very effective. That countries which we've sanctioned for decades still seem to be doing whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is, it's not, it's in my view, it's not a very useful approach. And it's never good enough. Maybe one wants to make it more costly for people to do whatever, things that we don't like them doing, to continue. But they're not going to stop. In other words, they're prepared to pay those costs. So sanctions alone, is not, a very useful policy in my view.
Okay, so we talked about the US sanctions. So now coming to the US influence in the Middle East. So in what ways does Russia's partnership with Iran challenges US influence in the Middle East region?
Well, I mean, in one sense, Russian-Iranian cooperation, I think, is actually helpful to the U.S. In other words, why is it that so many countries in the Middle East have turned to the U.S. for support? Not because they love us, and certainly not because they love democracy. It's because they fear someone else. And for many of them, that someone else is Iran. So in fact, I think that while a lot of these countries, all of them, have sort of flirted with Russia, that it's partly, I think, their way of trying to get the U.S. interested in them. What they're afraid of is that, oh, the U.S. has lost interest in the Middle East, but they know we're interested in Russia and its activities. Therefore, at least doing something with the Russians sort of gets the attention of the Americans. So that's the thing. Because the more that Russia does for Iran, the more its own balancing act becomes more difficult. That yeah, the U.S. may be unhappy that the Saudis, the Emiratis in particular, are working with the Russians, but they're not letting go of the American connection. That's for sure. In other words, they don't want to switch allies, like, now it's like if they don't think the US is going to help them enough against Iran, well, Russia certainly isn't going to do so. It's not in a position to do so. So, it's always, I ever since I've been studying this for like half a century now, I've always heard that, oh, America's losing influence in the Middle East. Well, it never seems to quite disappear. In other words, that it always seems to be present. And I imagine that, so long as the U.S. government is willing to support these countries, that they will not repudiate American support. That's for sure.
Yeah, so how do Russia and Iran view their cooperation in the context of global power shift? Is this partnership merely tactical, or could it involve like more permanent strategic alliance?
Russian-Iranian partnership, right? Well, I think it is. I think that it's not just tactical. In other words, they do, ultimately, they're the basis of both the Russian and the Iranian governments, is deep animosity and resentment toward America and the West. That this is something that really, draws them together, despite a lot of differences. And certainly the Russians have never been shy about taking advantage of Iran, which they've done historically, for centuries. And certainly people always ask here, oh, now that Russia is receiving drones from Iran, what are they going to do for Iran? What are they going to do in return? I think the Iranians themselves are asking this question, what are they going to do in return? Because they don't really, they haven't done as much as they could. We've heard about the Su-35 fighter aircraft that are supposed to be delivered to Iran. They haven't been. They're apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal, just sitting in Siberia. In other words, they're out of range of Ukrainian missiles, but not doing anything for Iran. Similarly, that they haven't transferred these S-400 air defense missiles. And we know, the Israelis made clear last spring, after the Iranian missile barrage, which wasn't very effective, the Israeli attack, they attacked an S-300 complex. In other words, they made it known that your Russian air defense equipment can't stop us. And so I think that the Iranians are not happy. On the other hand, I think that the Iranians have this long view. In other words, that basically, I think that their sense is that so long as the United States is focused on supporting Ukraine, um, then they're not so focused on the Middle East, and that's to Iran's advantage. And certainly, Iran cannot afford to see Russia lose the war, whatever that means. In other words, that if that happens, then are they on their own with the U.S.? Because, we've seen that, you know, whatever their complaints about how much the Russians have or have not armed them, there's no one else. In other words, China is not going to be shipping them weapons. Chinese seem to want to avoid conflict, at least in the Middle East, different, closer to their own borders. That's where they're focused, I guess. And no one else is going to help the Iranians. So I think for the Iranians, it's yeah, if their drones can keep the Russians in the fight, then that's a good investment as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, so you talked about the drones. So, considering the international response to the Ukraine conflict, how might Iran's military support for Russia, such as the drone technology, alter the course of war and influence global perceptions of both nations?
Well, I think that there's other weapons. There's been reports about Iranian, ballistic missiles going to Russia, but there doesn't seem to be any proof. In other words, if this has happened, the Russians haven't used them. In other words, the Ukrainians haven't found any evidence that Iranian missiles have been, targeted against Ukraine, and they study these things pretty closely, and they have friends who help them with this as well. I think that. Otherwise, both obviously, Russia and Iran are, promoters of the, global South narrative. Certainly, they have benefited from the view that, oh, the Americans, they're all upset about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but what about what the Israelis are doing against the Palestinians, or any number of issue basically that that Westerners are only concerned with people like themselves, like Ukrainians, essentially, and not about other parts of the world. And I think this message resonates, in many, many countries. I mean, I know it does. I've been involved in, Zoom with, a South African audience. It was really quite amazing that, but in any event, so they have propaganda advantages. On the other hand, it's I think that a lot of countries in the global South are not exactly supporting what Russia's doing. In other words, that they're uneasy. In other words, they don't see Russia as doing something that they want Russia to be doing. That they're so I think that it's but then there is this general sense of an emerging multipolar world order. Now, in my view, the world was never unipolar or even bipolar. It's always been pretty multipolar, and smaller nations have a lot of impact. There's that if that big countries have big ambitions, but they don't focus. Whereas smaller nations focus on, right their own immediate, vicinity, and they can wear great powers out. And so I think that that's something that we have seen as well. So, this I don't think that the Russians, I think, were hoping that the BRICS in particular would be sort of an anti-Western bloc, but it's kind of hard to have a bloc when the two biggest members of the BRICS, China and India, are at odds with each other. Where's the alliance there? And there are other, the nations they admitted, Iran on the one hand, the United Arab Emirates. It's not clear the Saudis have taken up their membership. It's very bizarre. Um, so it's like there's a lot of issues, within what used to be called the third world. That's how I'm used to it. That's just the term I grew up with from the 1970s. I'm not quite sure what the difference is. But in any event, the global south is not a unified bloc. And there are some countries in the global south which are quite anti-Western, but there's a lot of countries in the global south which, whatever their differences with the West, they want to cooperate with it on a lot of different issues, whether it's trade or even, defense issues. It's maybe they want to change the relative balance of the relationship, but they don't want, they're not going to go out and, join the ranks of the, anti-Westerners in confronting them. So that I think is there's a limit, I think, to what Russia and Iran can do.
Yeah. So you talked about India. So how do you analyze the role of India in this whole situation? Do you think India is cooperating with West or is maintaining a more pro-Russian stand or is neutral according to your view?
Well, I think India is pursuing its own national interests, and I think that just look at the map, and there, India has, an adversary on one side, Pakistan, and another adversary, China, on the other. That's like, right up against you, and they cooperate with each other, China and Pakistan. There's no question about that. Uh, Certainly during the Cold War, the Soviet Union uh, was very helpful to India at the time of the Sino-Soviet rift. In other words, that I think what India is used to is a Russia that is nervous about China. And I think in India, people are waiting for Russia to return to its senses. So that every one of China's neighbors fears China except for Russia. Why is that? And certainly, back when I would visit Russia, a lot of younger Russians think about this too. In other words, that they see this uh, Russia-China relationship is limited to Putin and Xi. That, change either one of these leaders, and the relationship is not going to be quite so friendly. And so I think that India is basically waiting for this. And also, I think that India doesn't, in other words, I think the problem, I think, for India is that Russia is now so dependent on China that it's not clear that Russia can meaningfully help India in any confrontation with China. On the other hand, I think India wants to get what it can from Russia while it can. The very fact that India and Russia cooperate sort of shows China that they don't have the monopoly on the relationship with Russia. So, yeah, it's, certainly, I think the U.S. in particular would love to see, India have a different policy, but India is following its interests. And to tell you the truth, I think that the relationship of the U.S. with India is so important that it's just something we have to agree to disagree upon, basically.
Yeah. So, I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that what potential scenarios do you foresee if the US or its allies, decide to take more aggressive steps to counteract the Russian military partnership, and could this escalation turn into a broader conflict? How do you see this?
Well, I really don't think there's much appetite in the West for a broader conflict, that's for sure. And to tell you the truth, I think on Russia's part, they had their hands full in Ukraine. In other words, that maybe the fact that I mean, certainly the Israel Hamas conflict has been useful for Russia in distracting the world from what's happening in Ukraine. But if there was a broader Middle East conflict, Russia really can't spare the forces to get involved. And, it's not clear to me. In other words, I think when you think about Iran and being aggressive, I think one has to really keep in mind the influence of the, Iran-Iraq War, which 1980 to 1988, which for both Iran and Iraq was essentially the equivalent of World War One, was, a years long killing machine. And I think that, Iran-Iraq war has been forgotten about in the West. But I think for Iranians, they do not want to have this again. So I'm hopeful that we're not going to see a broader conflict in the Middle East. Certainly the Sunni Arab governments, they're not interested in anything like this. I mean, there are those who argue that, I mean, Netanyahu of Israel, would like to see such a conflict because, he wants to bring the U.S. in essentially for his own support. But I'm not sure, one can talk about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. One can talk about the Indian-Israeli relationship, but that's for, I guess, another subject altogether. It's very surprisingly friendly. But in any event, I mean, I think the one thing that Israel has benefited from is that uh, there has been a lot of support for Israel. But the U.S. is changing. In other words, there's been demographic change. We're going from minority white to minority non-white. And support for Israel has been concentrated, I think, in the white population, the older white population. I remember Israel from before 1967 when it was so little and weak, and that's the image that a lot of older people have. It's not the image that younger people have. Now, the thing is about Israel in terms of being an ally for the U.S. is that it's been great. In other words, unlike most allies, you give Israel the weaponry and they can do the job on their own, unlike Afghanistan or Iraq or South Vietnam or all these other places that no matter how much you give them, they can't manage it. But the Israelis have. And so that I think, they have benefited from that. And there's a lot of admiration for them because of that. If the U.S. ever has to send armed forces to defend Israel, I think that what we'll find is that public attitudes in the US toward Israel suddenly become much more critical. That uh, it's wait a minute, why do we have to risk death for this? In other words, and so in my view, it's in Israel's interests not to bring about such a situation. So, and I'm hoping that even someone like Netanyahu has the sense to understand that, because certainly that a lot of Israelis they understand that American attitudes are changing, and it's been a function of domestic politics. What I think is fascinating is that now. American politicians now have to worry about the Muslim vote in the U.S. There are certain places, in particular, Michigan, Minnesota, that the Palestine, concern for Palestine is an issue that people vote on. It used to be just that, you know, uh, there are people who were, voted for support for Israel. That was their main thing, and of course, there are still a lot of such people. But now that there's also another side to that, and it's significant. In other words, that it affects one's electoral prospects. So that we have a growing Muslim population, um, and we have you know growing non-white population. Just isn't not that they're necessarily anti-Israeli. They're just not as they don't understand why the U.S. has been so attached to it, basically. So and I think that um, you know, the world is sort of watching all this, and I think that there's a lot of politicians in Israel, like Netanyahu, who I don't think fully understand, or maybe they do, uh, and so they have to do whatever they're going to do now, as opposed to later on. But American support for Israel has always been a function of American domestic politics, not so much its foreign policy interests. And as American domestic politics are changing, I don't see the U.S. ever becoming, anti-Israeli, but I do see it becoming either less supportive or at least support with conditions, basically. Uh, so that's my view of that.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time, and thank you so much for sharing your valuable thoughts. Really hope that the world becomes less of a dangerous place to live in. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, well, thank you so very much for having me. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much.